everyone, and welcome to today's session. I'm Evelyn Ojeda. I am the Director of Professional Development at the Light Center, and we're so excited to have you here today with us. And I hope you'll find this next hour informative, applicable, and of course, enjoyable. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few ground rules to ensure that everyone has a positive and productive experience during this webinar. Please keep your microphone muted throughout the presentation. This will help minimize background noise and ensure that everyone can hear me clearly. I will be the speaker for today's session. If you have any questions for me, please use the chat box. But since we're not too many people, feel free to open your microphone and collaborate and cooperate with this webinar. Finally, we'll be recording this session and it will be available on the PD2Go newsletter as we normally do every month. So welcome again to May's Professional Development Webinar, Online Engagement on GAP. During the next hour, we will explore the importance of investing time and effort to improving student engagement on GAP. We will also discuss various strategies and types of questions that we can ask students to keep them engaged as they complete their weekly tasks on GAP. We'll also take a look at the online engagement requirements set by Wascliffe University so we can make sure that we are meeting those standards. So let's get started. So basically what we're going to be doing today is that we are going to go through the webinar goals, discuss why do we need to engage students. Is teaching not enough? So why are we talking about this? The requirements set by Wascliffe University, some tips and tricks that we can share with you concerning the types of questions that by research, we know that they will enhance engagement and critical thinking in your students. And we're going to have a quick revision. So by the end of this webinar, you will be able to reflect on why you should invest time and efforts on improving your students' online engagement. Keep in mind that this webinar is based on the GAP, the weekly tasks that we have on GAP, but it's actually applicable to your VCS or OCS, because what we're going to be discussing is how you can ask questions to students, and that can be done orally as well during your live sessions. We are going to discuss different strategies to engage students online, and of course, identify the requirements established by our university in terms of online engagement. I cannot see anyone's camera because I have my presentation open, but please feel free to open your microphones and comment if necessary. So before we get started, there are just 7 people, so we can totally have this conversation here on the main room. What did you understand by student engagement, and why is that important? Think about your courses here at Wascliffe. So what do you understand by, okay, I need to engage my students? And then why caring about this?
I'll start.
Sure.
I was presented with this question when I first logged in. And to me, student engagement is getting students to link what we're trying to teach them or what they're trying to learn to their previous experiences, previous education. We want to create this link and get them to think a little more deeply about our chosen topics, and how does what we're learning or what we're teaching them right now, how does that relate to their life, their profession? I want to create that critical link between them and the learning.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I guess per my understanding, what is the student engagement to be really a part of the class discussion. The students should come prepared. For example, we can give them opportunity to share some examples, to talk, to discuss, to be an effective part of the class session, not only attending and the whole load on the faculty himself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Nino. Sean? Professor
Yeah,
Daly?
just going off of what the other two commenters said, I think it has to do with like interest and curiosity and motivation for the students as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why it's important. One of the, if you have a look, well, let's read this first, and then we'll have a look at some research dealing with student engagement, and we will see why we need to really care about this. Just go beyond the content that we need to cover. I understand. I've been there. I always teach. I'm always teaching 2 or 3 classes a session, and I understand the need of covering the content, but what for if your students are not engaged? So that's why we feel, at the Light Center, we feel that this is really important to cover in our trainings. So according to Berkeley, student engagement is a product of motivation and active learning. It is a product, it's not the sum, because it will actually, it doesn't happen if any of these elements are missing. So, and I have another question for you, and that has to do also with why it's important. There's no point of teaching if nobody's learning. So what's the point of you covering 3 hours of BCS, 2 hours, and then you see your students' faces, you see that they're not, well, maybe they didn't even come prepared to class. But if there's no one teaching, if there's no one learning, why teaching? We can see that in research, it's been proved that there is a connection between student engagement and actually retention, or students who are engaged with academic success, because they're learning more actively, as one of you said, they're learning for life. So they're learning, they're actually owning and are being responsible for their own learning. But well, before I move on, I would like to go back here and say, okay, there's no point in teaching if nobody's learning. I hope you agree with this. But then my question is, how do you know your students are learning? Say you have 20 students in your class, 25. I'm very lucky that I get to have only 3, 2, 1, because the METSO program is quite small. But what happens when you have 20, 15 students, 25 students? How do you know they're learning? How can you tell as their instructors that they are engaged, that they're actually learning?
I'll go again.
Sure.
I don't mind being first.
So okay.
In my case, I look for an active conversation. In my live classes, I ask questions that I require all of my students to answer. This tells me that they're at least engaged in the question themselves. I do have to take into account that some students are a little shy, and sometimes it's very difficult to get them to speak out openly in class. But I do my best to encourage students to, if they provide a written response to a question I've asked, I would also like for them to give me a verbal response. I do my best to push for a verbal response without being really too pushy.
Okay, anyone else? Thank you so much. I thought it was me. Very good. Okay. I absolutely agree with you, Professor. And I like the idea of course, an oral response when we are doing VCS or CS. That's key. You realize, okay, my students are actually paying attention. The quality of the response is important. And we will see in a few minutes how, so as to achieve that quality response, we need to know how to ask the proper questions. Anyone else? How do you know your students are learning?
Yeah, I think you have to check for understanding. If you don't check for understanding, use like formative assessment or even summative assessment and give feedback, then there's no way that you can be sure that any learning is actually happening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. We have lots of resources on Spoke dealing with the checkpoints, because it's key. When you plan your lesson and then you just plan a lecture in which you're just talking and talking, but you don't build checkpoints in the class, how do you know you can move on? How do you know you achieved an objective so you can move on to the next one? So that's really key. Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else?
If the question is related, how do we know the student learning inside the class, not the end of the session? So, for example, when we give them opportunity to, or we ask them questions, so, and we see them like really they engage, or when they ask us questions as faculty as well, or when they share real examples, or they ask about specific examples, that means the students are attached, engaged, and learning.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. It's absolutely true. So now that we have discussed what student engagement is and what its engaged student looks like, a motivated student looks like, I want to ask you these 3 questions. Let's start with the first one. Because we are here to learn, okay, we know that we have weekly discussions on GAP. We need to engage students. I've been there. I know it's not easy. I know it's a challenge. I know we are always thinking, how do I do this in terms of them posting on time? They have quality responses, quality posts, and all that. So I wonder if you have ever thought of this. What is the purpose of course online discussions? When you open your syllabus, okay, you're going to teach this course, this session, and then you open your syllabus and you realize that there are weekly discussion questions or weekly tasks. What's the purpose of those? What do you think?
Should I go first again?
Go ahead.
Discussions are always great. Discussions are to try to get students to interact with one another, someone besides their instructor or professor. Each of us, particularly with Westcliff, since we are such an international university, but the discussions are designed, everybody comes from a different culture, different ethnicity, different language, different times, different something. And getting them to engage one another gives alternate perspective besides just their professor. So it allows them to kind of, blend everything and everyone together. It gives them an opportunity to learn from other students in addition and learn other perspectives.
Thank you so much. I really like what you said because you are on point on this. When we talk about online discussions or when we create these activities on GAP, that is exactly the purpose, to give students the opportunity to read other perspectives. As you said, we come from all over the world. We have more than 100 nationalities at Westcliff. So it's a perfect opportunity to not only continuously learning, so students don't only attend class and they're learning for 2 hours, but they need to remember that we use the flip classroom model, which means that they come prepared to class, they read, and they participate on the post. So this is basically it, and it's key. It gives the opportunity for actually providing students with an inclusive education, so they can actually contextualize their learning through these online discussions. And it's exactly that, what you said. It's about promote, empowering, and reaching high quality academic conversations, not just like content, copy and paste. No, it's about debating, talking, discussing in a reflective, critical way, in a way that you can see that they're actually applying learning, but they're also able to contextualize whatever they're learning in the class to their own context and situations. It's important that you know, and I'm sure you do, but I just want to make sure that when you get it a syllabus in your hand, you know that the discussions or any weekly task of whatever is included in the syllabus is based on the textbooks, the readings, the research, everything that is provided on the syllabus. So students need to read that before, and you should also read that before engaging in conversations on GAP. And what happens if they're not discussion questions? Well, it seems like the curriculum champions working amazingly hard to improve our syllabi. We are kind of walking away a little bit from discussion questions, and or maybe we have discussion questions, but they are more interactive. They're more engaging. So there will always be something to do. Either it's I mean, reading or teamwork, or there's always something in the syllabus that you can use to engage your students on GAP. And we're actually doing that because of what Professor Jackson said. It's about making sure that we provide students with opportunity to interact. Let me check the chat if there's anything. Oh, that's a thing. Also, when you don't have classes, that's an issue. Okay,
I
let's
have a
have a look.
question.
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead. Mhm.
Thank you. I can go back to the slide, to the previous
Sure.
slide. I
just look.
totally agree with the idea of a discussion question where is the opportunity really to engage the student and so on. However, I think it should we should consider two things. The first one, it is how is the question is written. So for example, some questions really are not engaged questions. So we really, the student maybe struggled how we answer or how we can respond even to peers on their discussion. So that's why we lack the purpose of the discussion question. We notice there is no communication, and this is really affect the student effort. The second one based on the feedback that I got from the student. If I put effort and I do search and I answer the question, what is the total percentage of the discussion question of the whole from the whole grade?
I understand.
So this is, I guess, to achieve the purpose of the discussion question and really to encourage the student, motivate them. I think it is my own opinion.
No, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank
And I'm
Thank
sure that some instructors and students believe the same, I mean, think about the same thing, that maybe the discussion questions scores are not that high. But of course, if we think about the product, right, the score, then we can think about that. But we think about the process, like why are discussion questions on the in the syllabus? If we make sure the students understand why it's there. But I agree with you that if maybe a higher score might help students get more engaged. But let me tell you this as well. Oh, well, sorry. Let me just answer. It says, what are these discussions based on? Self-reflection and sharing their experience. Yeah, absolutely. But it's also a way for you to make sure that your students are reading the resources provided every week, that they're able to think critically, that they're able to actually carry on discussing academically and respectfully, considering other people's opinions. And that's your job. Your job is the facilitation of that conversation taking place online. So going back to my previous point, yes, I agree that maybe its scores are higher, they will be more motivated. But since this is not in our hands, let's discuss what we can do, what is actually on what we can do from our side. That is, what do we do to engage them? So let's say that you have a question that is not that engaging. It happens. I've been there. Then it's my job as an instructor to keep on asking follow-up questions that make the conversation interesting. Provide more resources while I'm responding to my students so they feel more engaged and they can read a little bit more about the topic. I have always said, and I'm very sure that if you've been into all of our webinars, you have heard this from me at least once. I love having discussion questions before I have VCS, because discussion questions, the posts that my students write, actually give me lots of data. They give me lots of ideas on how I can approach the topic in my class. I can see where the weaknesses are. I can actually see the strengths, like, oh, they have been discussing about this really well. I don't need to discuss this anymore. But I see that they are not really grasping this concept. Then I take that data that I get from online discussions to enrich my lesson plans. Now, let's talk about WhatScript University requirements. What type of replies do you think we are expected on GAP, and how we can grade DQs on GAP? You might know already how to grade DQs, but I've been taking lots of courses on GAP, and I know that some of us still need training on how to do this properly because we need to use a rubric for this purpose. So basically, what is the type of replies that we are expected to give each week to our students? Well, it has to be responses that promote conversations, academic conversations online regarding the course material. And I'm being specific about this because I have taught several courses, and I know that if I'm not facilitating the online discussion properly, it can deviate. And then at the end of the week, it's just like, okay, it was a nice conversation, interesting, but it has nothing to do with the learning goals of my course. So we need to be extremely careful when it comes to that. And of course, you have to respond to students. Again, this is for you. This is not for students. This is for you. You need to post responses that encourage your students to think critically. And you can provide them with more examples. Sometimes discussion questions are so wide that you really need to help students contextualize that content. And of course, they love listening to their professors and the real world experiences that they have. Any questions? Any comments? I didn't post here, but you should receive this. I'm sure that you receive this every session that you're teaching, the amount of posts that you have to complete every week. I don't want to discuss that right now because I just want to concentrate on strategies for engaging students, but I just want you to know that we are revising those expectations because we listen to you, we listen to faculty members, and we are now in conversations about this, about what's best for faculty and what's best for students, of course. So before I visit GAP, I would like to know, do you all know how to grade DQs and GAP? Most of you do? Okay, so let me just stop sharing and let me share I'm going to go very quickly because I want to show you something. There you go. Just give me a sec, please. I cannot get out of the presentation. Okay. Sorry about this. Oh yeah, there you go. Okay, so I'm going to show you, I'm going to open just one of my courses. Can you see my screen? Can you? Okay, sure. So
Yes.
as you have your posts, there's here a button that says create users. I just want to show you here. I think I only have 2 students, 3 students. Okay, now let me just go back. Okay. Just wanted to show you this. When you click on grading students, you get to see the posts. I have 2 students only in this class. You get to see the posts for every student, and then you have here the rubric. You should use the rubric to grade, and then you can actually give additional feedback. This is really important. Why? Say that your student got a 15. How do they know how to improve? The only way to know why they got a 15 is that if you use the additional feedback. So once you finish, you decide whether you want to send an email to your students or not, and then you save, and that's about it. But I wanted to show you something. Let me just go to the questions. Did you know that you now can check whether your students are using artificial intelligence to respond to their posts? I know that we know that we can check on Turnitin, but right now I am going to show you that you can actually click here and you go to Turnitin. So the response that your student submits on the discussion questions goes to Turnitin, and you can check here the artificial intelligence. This is not possible because it's an old paper. But in during this session, you can check. If you have doubts, if you see it, because even if it says here 5%, this is 5% of plagiarism, right, of similarity. But then when you click here, you will see also artificial intelligence. Let me tell you this. Last session, I had a student who had 3% on the similarity. But then I clicked because I know the student, and I was like, yes, this so beautiful. Let me just check. And then I checked, and it was 100% artificial intelligence. So don't rely only on this percentage. Click if you feel like you need to revise this a couple of times more.
I have a
Absolutely.
question.
Sorry. Mhm.
May I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
This is good point just to discuss. Do you mean it showed 3% on the Turnitin, but when you clicked on the paper, it showed 100% on the
Eh,
AI similarity?
Exactly.
And
Yes,
in
it
this case, we should consider it is as a really plagiarism, like we
is.
should give 0 to the students or what?
Well, what I did, I agree. I understand the point of. Are we sure that it's actually artificial intelligence generated? When you have 100%, it is for sure. No questions about it. When you have a lower percentage, you might actually consider going back to. Talk to the student or going back to the text and see what's going on. Because sometimes it's because students wrote everything and they use artificial intelligence to check grammar and spelling. So that also causes a high percentage. I'm not saying that you click and it's, oh, it says 60%, that's plagiarism. Just talk to the student and see how she or he used artificial intelligence. Professor Amarin?
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk. Actually, when the text is generated by AI and it appears on the student's paper or work or discussion question, it is not plagiarism. It is similarity. Why? Because
Exactly.
you know the source. Plagiarism when you don't know the. If I copied the text, I didn't announce or cited the source of the material. It is plagiarism when I am hiding the source. But similarity, it is similarity in AI. So we have to deal with that as a similarity, not a plagiarism. Because if we want to deal with it as a plagiarism, I have to report this student for you. So
Exactly.
because there's a procedures for that. So we have to just distinguish between the similarity with the AI and plagiarism by itself.
Absolutely. And that's what I said. The percentage that you see on the discussion questions is not AI. So it's not.
Yeah,
It
it's
might be.
different. No, it is different. I am talking about the similarity with AI. The other similarity is other sources. No, I am talking about
Exactly.
the AI similarity. Yes, you are right.
Absolutely. Yeah. But the only way to get it, and that's my point, that's what I wanted to open Gap and have a look at it. The only way to get that AI similarity is by clicking on the percentage so as to get to turn it in. If not, you won't be able to check whether artificial intelligence was used. Unfortunately, this is more work for us. I understand. I've been there. I'm teaching all the time. So, but we have to do it just to make sure that students are, being honest with their work. Let me share again my screen. And let's continue reflecting. I have a question for the audience. Does anyone need to say something? Okay, not please mute your mic. Okay, thank you. So how can critical thinking be encouraged, student engagement enhanced, and motivation fostered during weekly online discussions on Gap? And this is a really broad question, but I would like to hear from you. What do you do? You have been, most of you have been teaching years here at Westcliff or in any other institutions in which we also have this asynchronous piece of teaching. So what do you do with your students to make sure that they're thinking critically, that they're engaged and they are motivated? And I'm not talking about VCS or CS, I'm talking about GAP, the courses and the weekly discussions on GAP.
I'll go first.
Please do.
One of the things that I always do is I try to use a Socratic method. I try to question my students to get them to think deeper about our topic. And sometimes I even play devil's advocate, and I will produce something just to get them to think critically. Let's look at this from a different perspective. So that's how I usually approach the discussion questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Jackson. And you will see that we will talk about Socratic questions in a bit. That is exactly what this training will be about. Anyone else? What do you do apart from using Socratic questions, which is key to making sure your students are encouraged, they're thinking critically, that they're actually posting quality responses that are leading to learning. So what else do you do?
I was going to say something similar. I ask specific questions if their student seems to be missing some information in part of their answer, or I want them to highlight something or touch on something a little bit deeper in their answer, then I ask specific pointed questions to try to elicit that information from them. And likewise, if a fellow student asks some questions and they don't receive an answer, then I try to also encourage the student that way in my feedback to make sure they answer all of the questions from their peers as well.
Thank you. That's a really good tip. Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Hi, Ev. You know, I have a critical thinking rubric that I use. So I have a scale of 0 to 4 that says, when you think critically in and out of the classroom, this is a 0. This is a 1. This is a 2, right? And I teach them what each one of those things mean. So to really see a high level of critical thinking, I explain to them that they use insightful reasoning and that it's varied and they look at things from multiple perspectives. Perhaps it's even widespread in terms of how they're applying that information in different contexts. And then I make sure that they habitually go back and forth and scaffold or, bring back what they've learned previously to what they're learning now, and then that they extend that analysis to new environments or innovations that may not be seen as connections, and then they rationalize those connections to really solidify their content. And then I know that they're thinking critically about that subject, that they can persuade and purposefully show me that they've made their point from their readings or from the variety of resources they've used to draw those conclusions.
Well, thank you so much for this tip. I never considered using a critical thinking rubric for my students to teach them. I always teach them what critical thinking looks like, but I love the idea of a rubric, Professor Constant. That's a really...
I'll share it with you, Eb.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I share with the audience?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'll do that. When we finish the webinar, I'll send this to you because we need to help each other. I really believe like when we get together, it's just like, okay, let's get ideas, let's see what's working for everyone else out there and see how it applies to our courses. I love the idea, and I wanted to mention that as well because that's what I do, is that I teach my students what critical thinking looks like, and I teach them also how to ask questions. Sometimes we just expect them to answer questions, but they can be the ones asking the questions. And actually, the questions asked, I'm talking about the GAP, I mean, the online discussions on GAP, the questions that they have asked, sometimes are like, oh, this is way better than the first discussion question on that I posted. And it's beautiful, it's lovely, and it's a way that you see, hey, they're actually learning. Let me check the chat here. Challenge students, discuss. Absolutely, I agree. Identify with the material by providing scenarios professionally. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing this. Now I'm going to give you a few tips on how you can enhance your students on GAP and what are the least time-consuming strategies for online engagement. I get it. You're going to tell me I work for 80 hours a week. It's yeah, I understand that. I understand that we're super busy, but we also need to understand that when we have a course to teach, it's our responsibility and it's part of our duty to make sure that those online conversations on GAP are taking place in a way and that we're facilitating those conversations in a way that learning is actually happening and students are engaged, and we can actually monitor learning throughout the whole week. So I have a few tips for you. First of all, use a tracking tool. You can ask your program chair about this. Well, because sometimes you don't need to answer to all students. So you need to make sure that you are actually reaching all students at certain point. So using a tracking tool of who you replied to, it's a good tip. You can use the course announcement section in GAP with a welcome message, participation clarification if needed, with extra tips and tricks, just to create community, if you like, in your class. That way, students also feel more engaged when you feel that they are a learning community. You should avoid grading comments. So I have an example here. Oh, thank you for posting, Tom, but it was a little short. Please add to it. So if you try just to not include any language that could be interpreted as, oh, this is my score. It's just or corrective. Just try to avoid those grading comments, and if you actually have to, just keep them private. So you can send the message privately. Keep the online conversation alive. We are using this online conversation, so learning happens not only during VCS, OCS, but it actually takes place every day of the week, if possible. Because when the discussions are live, well, your students are learning. And students can actually, as Dr. Nina said, they see the value of participating if the conversations are interesting and that they feel like, I'm learning from this. Ask questions, and that's one of the top tips that I would suggest. Every time you respond to a student, continue with a follow-up question so you keep the conversation alive. And share personal experiences. I'm not talking about super private personal. I'm talking about professional experiences that you have had so as to help your students understand the content. You should suggest extra resources. So it doesn't need to be research. It can be just a video, a post on Facebook, on Instagram. It could be anything that can help them understand the content better. And apply the sandwich approach. Basically, you read something your students wrote and you feel like, okay, this is not really good, but there should be something good there. So you just go and provide positive information at the beginning and at the end, and in the middle, you just kind of use it to, with a very respectful language, help your students understand how they can improve their learning. You should post first. This is one of the requirements at Westcliff. We are continuing to use a different way for students to post their weekly responses. So until they have completed their initial DQ response, they will not be able to see other students' response. So that they need to post first before anything. Use, of course, positive reinforcement. Be positive, be affirmative with anything you say. Use language that is bias-free. I would recommend to set a daily time to check engagement. If you check for 15, 20 minutes, you need to sit for hours every day, sorry. But if you actually save 15 minutes of your time to just check how the conversation is going, if you have to intervene to help the conversation continue, or you have to clarify certain doubts, or then doing that every day is necessary. And use private posts. If you feel like your students are not really adding to the conversation, or you need to say something that can be misinterpreted, well, there is a reason why there is a button that says reply privately. Any other strategy or tip that you believe you want to share with us that you have tried in your class and you would like to share with all of us?
I do. One of my, would you expect any less?
No.
One of my favorite books is by seminal authors in leadership, and I used it in my own learning. And now I use it teaching from it. And I love the book, The Leadership Challenge. Cowles and Posner tell us that one of the most important aspects is to tell a story. You mentioned, not to make it too personal, but sometimes when you link something that ties in your personal life, for example, to leadership and to your experience, it really helps students understand where you're coming from. I try to tell a story. I try to encourage my students to tell a story. How do I apply what I'm learning? Tell me a story about how you applied what you're learning to your life. That's a strategy that I love and I will continue to use. Always tell a story.
That's a really good tip. Thank you so much. We also have a few resources on Spoke dealing with how to become storyteller, if you like, in your classes, because it has been proven by research that is quite engaging. It actually boosts engagement when students are able to listen to their professors and they are, they tell their own stories. Now, the best tip that I can give you today to improve student motivation and engagement on GAP, and it applies also to your VCS or OCS, is ask questions. Questions that are provoking, questions that encourage critical thinking, and of course, enhance meaningful online participation. And I'm going to give you a few tips on what type of questions you can ask. But before that, you might want to by asking questions. There's already a question posted on GAP. I should just say, okay, good job. I agree with you. I disagree with you. Well, asking questions is actually great for students because it helps them build their understanding. It's going to promote high-level thinking and draws out what students are thinking. For me, that's key, the third one. So when I ask my students follow-up questions after they have posted on GAP, and they reply to those questions. My question is very specific, like I have a purpose in mind. I want to know if they're actually learning, what they're actually thinking. And I use that, as I said before, to design the best possible lesson plan for my students. A lesson plan that actually a path that meets their needs. So when you ask questions, make sure that you not only use or ask the right questions, and we will discuss that in a minute, but you actually, when you're on the online forum, please show interest in all answers. And please make sure that you redirect or guide run answers towards a more appropriate one. And develop responses that will keep students thinking and adding to the online conversation. So the posts that you reply to when you reply to your students, those posts should be engaging enough so that you keep the conversation alive. And for the first point, I would like to point out that I completed my PhD online. I started face-to-face, but then I moved here to the Netherlands, so I finished online. And I remember posting my weekly responses, and just waiting for my professor to reply to me. To show interest in what I had to say. So I think that's really important, that students feel heard, that they feel like, okay, my professor is reading what I'm writing. And I'm very sure that if they know that you're reading and you're engaging with them through what they are writing, they will also feel more motivated and engaged in terms of participating in the online discussions. Now let's talk about the type of questions that you can use. And Professor Jackson was talking about this, the Socratic questions. So I'm going to show you, I think, 5. There are a lot. So I just included, I think, 5 of them. And there's actually a course on Socratic questions on Spoke. It's called Helping Your Students Think Critically. And I will add that also to the PD2Go newsletter, so you have access to all of that. So you can actually ask questions to clarify thinking. So you want to a student posts something and you want to make sure that you understand they're actually following what they're saying. So you can ask for an example. You can ask them to explain further, to elaborate on that or on their idea. You can actually ask them to clarify any of those ideas that they shared, or you can actually rephrase what they're saying and see if that is exactly what they meant. Let me check the chat box. It's also, I agree, Professor McCoy. It's important to tell stories, but it's also important to listen to our students' stories. There's another type of Socratic questions, and that's the one that challenges assumptions. You have to teach your students to ask these questions to their classmates. So when they're posting, they're replying to their classmates, ask them to challenge those points of views, those opinions. So things like, what are we assuming this, or is the assumption that? Is that always the case? What would it be different? What is the exception? So those types of what would happen if, so those types of questions that actually assume that there's another way to see the same situation are great for keeping the online conversation alive. And everything that I'm sharing with you right now can be applied to you as instructor, you asking the question, but you can also teach this to your students, how you can ask each other questions during online discussions, so the conversations are more of quality, if you like. You can also use the Socratic questions to examine reasoning or evidence. So in this way, you can help your students examine the rationale, the reasons behind an argument, with questions like, why did you think this, or how do you know about this, or what made you reach this conclusion or belief or anything, or how can you support this idea, or why do you think the evidence is valid, or how can you find out if this is true, what you're saying is true. So this way, students have to actually go back to what they replied and then reason their answers and give or support their ideas. We can also ask questions to students so as to help them explore different perspectives. We started the conversation talking about, okay, why do we have online discussions, weekly discussions online? We came to the conclusion that it's because we want students to interact, because we want students to have to read different perspectives concerning the same topic. So, well, when you post your replies to your students, also make sure that you give them opportunities to think about their answers or the situation that you are discussing, the discussion questions, from a different perspective. You can ask them questions like, what's another way to look at it? Or what are some alternative ideas concerning what you just said? Or who might see this differently and why? This way we broaden their way, their vision of the world, and we help them think critically. Let me check the chat box. That is true. That's well, I also enjoyed that a lot, Professor McCoy. When it comes to having these discussions also in class and on Gab, I really enjoy seeing when they're learning. I really enjoy seeing their perspective. And again, I use all that to plan my classes. For me, that's like big data that I use for that purpose. Now a different type of Socratic question is the one that helps your students zoom out and consider the consequences or implications of a problem or a decision or an idea that they gave. It's about considering the consequences or implications of whatever they posted as truth, if you like, on Gab. So questions like, how does this affect this, or how does your idea tie in with or what does our experience tell us, or what are the larger implications of this problem or our decision. Sometimes students' posts are not that deep, and they believe like, oh, I'm just something to tick off my list. But then if you ask these questions in which they have to consider the implications and they have to think further, then we are helping them to learn deeply and critically. And then, of course, question the question. So don't be afraid to teach your students to, get meta with questions like, okay, what is the point of purpose of, and then you elaborate on one of the ideas given by students. Why are we asking, solving, considering this situation now, for example? Oh, how might we reframe the question, decision, problem? Say that, as Professor Nina said at the beginning, there are certain discussion questions that are like, oh no, this is, and we cannot change them, right? They're in the syllabus. So you can actually question the question so to help your students have a more engaging and the ultimate learning experience, if you like, during these online conversations. Any questions? Any comments? What other types of questions do you ask your students? Sorry. Okay, if not, just keep in mind that, again, when you are engaging your students on the online conversations taking place on GAP, you need to follow up with a follow-up question. So just talk to, write to your student about something good about the post, or as we said, the sandwich approach, like, okay, this is good. Can you elaborate on this idea? Using Socratic questions, and then end up with something positive. But then please also include a follow-up question. So it doesn't need to be that elaborated, but something that makes them think further, something that makes the conversation online on GAP alive and being, and take place every day of the week. Now let's review how to boost learner online engagement on GAP. Let's see if we got some takeaways from today's session. Let's see. I have a question for you. The degree of attention, curiosity, interest, optimism a student has for online learning is actually not directly affected by the strategies an instructor implements when facilitating online discussions on GAP. Use the chat box to tell me whether you believe this is true or false. Let's see. Absolutely. It is absolutely false. The degree of attention is indeed directly affected by the strategies we use when facilitating online discussions on GAP. Now, to exceed expectations, your responses to students' posts on GAP should encourage critical thinking and provide real-world professional experiences. What do you think about this? True or false? Absolutely true. Your replies to students' posts should encourage them to think critically, to give them the opportunity to engage with real-world situations so as to boost their learning possibilities. Now, instructors should always share personal information on their post in order to create a classroom community. What do you think? Is that true or false? See, absolutely false. Sharing your personal and professional experience is actually key to engaging students, but personal information not related to the course is actually discouraged. If you're going to use your personal experience, and you can connect the content of your class with that, that's absolutely amazing, and that's engaging, and that's meaningful. That's what we have to do. But just personal experience that has nothing to do with the course is actually not recommended in when facilitating online discussions. Now, the last question, I believe, when replying to students in GAP, instructors should always point out not only what is good about the post, but also correct students publicly so the same mistakes do not happen with other students. Is that true or false? Absolutely false. The sandwich approach, as we said before, is a good way to accomplish this. So you provide positive information at the beginning and at the end, and meaningful feedback to improve in the middle. And of course, there's always a moment in which you have to correct your students, or they wrote something that it concerns you. So you go ahead and address it, but reply privately on GAP.